Ambassador Matthew Bryza, George Friedman, the founder and chairman of Geopolitical Futures, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you. The two of you met in Turkey, and this is a place that has numerous issues and questions revolving around it right now. Why don't you, first of all, you live there, Ambassador.
Yeah.
Why don't you give me a brief overview of the situation in Turkey as it stands today, and especially as you look back over the last 6 months to a year with a coup, the situation in Syria, President Trump. There's so many things that are revolving around this country right now.
Yeah, it's hard to figure out where to begin, in fact. But right now, the situation in Turkey is tense politically on both sides of the proverbial aisle there. You've got President Erdogan, who thinks he may be on the verge of achieving his long-standing goal, which would be a change in the constitution to alter the political system to one that's based on presidential rule rather than parliamentary. So his people, though, are quite nervous that he doesn't have enough votes, which led to the intensity, I think, a couple of weeks ago over the visits of ministers of Turkey to the Netherlands, to Germany, where the rhetoric was really hyped up. I think it was probably hyped up for effect more than raw emotion to try to get out the vote on the Erdogan side. On the other side of the debate, the people who oppose him are really worried he is going to win the referendum and the system's going to change. So tension is high politically. Terrorist threat is very high. I mean, where I live in Istanbul, I know there are ISIS cells all over the place. One was just wrapped up a week and a half ago, quite close to where I live, the part of Istanbul where I live. Then you've got PKK terrorism, so the Kurdish terrorism in the southeast, mostly focusing on security services, police. But you never know if you're caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. So a lot of tension on that security side as well. You have the overhang, as you mentioned, of the failed coup attempt of last July. To me, that was the people doing it really thought that they were fighting a coup, trying to overthrow Erdogan, and Erdogan's response has been intense, as we know, with 10, 20,000 people arrested, 100,000 people lost their jobs, a full-scale cleansing of the Fethullah Gülen following, and probably beyond that in Turkey. When it comes to U.S.-Turkey relations, then you've got two very serious bits of tension. One is Fethullah Gülen, the reclusive preacher based in Pennsylvania. From Turkish perspective, it's incomprehensible that if somebody the Turkish government has deemed a terrorist is living in the United States and the United States doesn't come up with an excuse to extradite him, it's incomprehensible that the U.S. could be behaving then as a loyal ally. They simply can't comprehend that the rule of law works in a certain way in this country. It works, I should say, and that you really do need a judge to make a decision on an extradition. And if the President of the United States were to conduct an extradition or a rendition operation, wow, that could lead to enormous political and legal consequences for the President and his team. So until Gülen is extradited, until the U.S. justice system finds a reason, maybe some sort of organized criminal prosecution, there'll be a real painful hole in U.S.-Turkish relations. And the last point is, as you mentioned, Syria. In Syria, these two NATO allies, the U.S. and and Turkey, often seem to be focusing on different objectives, with the U.S. placing the defeat of ISIS as the number one goal, and with the Turks, number one objective being to make sure that there's no Kurdish political entity that can be formed along the Syrian-Turkish border. And again, sort of like in the case of not understanding why Fethullah Gülen, who's considered a leader of a terrorist group, isn't extradited, it's really hard for the Turkish government to understand why the U.S. chooses to work with the Kurdish militia, the YPG, which is affiliated with the PKK, and doesn't rely on its Turkish military ally, to which the U.S. replies, well, okay, show us your plan, Turkish military. Well, where are you? You want the assault on Raqqa? How many troops are you going to put there on the front lines? And we don't want it to be like what happened in Kobane, where the Turkish tanks were simply poised on the hillside as the Kurds were being slaughtered. So a complex mix, which you outlined in your question, and it's going to lead to turbulence politically and in the security realm as well, turbulence in U.S.-Turkish relations, turbulence at home, and then ultimately it gets to the economy, where there is low foreign direct investment, where there is concern among business people about the rule of law, but where there's tremendous promise. It's a huge country, 80 million people, is a democracy, as strange as it may be, and it occupies some really valuable territory as well. So I think in the longer term, Turkey is a good bet. The Turkish economy is a great bet. I've bet not only with my feet, but with my wallet, in however humble way I have. And I think in the long run, I'll keep betting on Turkey.
So I want to jump in and rewind a little bit to something that you talked about near the beginning of your answer, and that was about this referendum that's going to be taking place. And I want to ask you a question that will then draw you, George, into this conversation. So first off, can you outline for the viewers what exactly this referendum actually does if it passes in Erdogan's favor? And if it does, what does that mean for Erdogan in Turkey and for the broader region, George?
If it passes, we see a new political system in which all executive power is centralized in the president or the presidency. So the expectation is, actually, the fact is that the position of prime minister will be abolished. So the person, Binali Yildirim, currently the prime minister, knows he won't have at least that job. Maybe he'll be a vice president if and when the referendum passes. The people in ministries aren't sure what their jobs will be. Conventional wisdom has emerged so far that it's actually the presidential staff where all important decisions are made. Ministries are a bit demoralized in Turkey. And if you look back just a little bit further to what the traditional role of the Turkish president has been, this is a radical reworking. Traditionally, the Turkish presidency, or the president, has been a ceremonial post. Somebody who's above politics, who has power, and who has a lot of moral suasion, but who is supposed to be apolitical. And now we're going to see that the president is not only the executive running the government, which was not the case before, but probably will be the leader of a political party as well. So it's a thoroughgoing change in the way Turkish politics is structured. On the other hand, it's kind of the way it's operating now anyway, some could argue. So, you know, the prime minister likes to say, well, we're simply going to formalize the reality of the day.
So what does this mean then for the broader region, George, if Erdogan gains this sort of, I guess, tacit legal authority within the country to be the man, so to speak?
Well, this is part of a broader change that's going on in Turkey and in the region. So we understand that Turkey is having this election. But what is really going on is that Turkey is transforming itself from what it was to what it will be. 40 years ago, the idea that the Russians and the Americans would have a crisis over Syria, and the Turks would be an equal player sitting at a table with them, that was inconceivable. So when we step back a bit, we see how far they've come. Now, the fact is that Turkey was a predominantly secular country after Ataturk, and the world around them, the Muslim world around them, has become activated. You can't simply be a secular country with that large a Muslim population. And Erdogan, sometimes brutally, is trying to figure out how to retain the secularists, because he needs them, and reconcile them with the Muslims. And that can be a pretty bloody process. But what is emerging out of that is the dominant regional power. So when the Middle East actually is calmed down, historically at least, it's been Turkey to calming. Turkey is operating there very cautiously. It doesn't want to get in over its head. It'd much rather have the Americans bear the burden, or even the Russians for that matter, because it knows they're going to leave and Turkey's going to stay there. So what I see happening is sort of, in a smaller way, what happened in the American Civil War. 600,000 dead. Brutal war. 35 years after the end, the United States is 1/2 of the world's manufacturing production. The idea that destabilization always means decline is not true. It frequently means decline. But in the case of Turkey, I think it is a necessary process that they're going through. And it's going to result in the regional power that it has to be, that it historically has been, that the past century has been an aberration for, and we're going to get back to it. You know, I totally agree with Matt that we are seeing a very unhappy time inside of Turkey. But somehow or another, if Turkey doesn't assume the role that it's traditionally had, I don't see how the instability south of it in the Middle East, in the Arab world, how the instability that's coming as Russia weakens and is weakening economically, how the Baltics plays out. Turkey is going to be, 20 years from now, 10 years from now, a major power, and there's blood to be shed before then.
You just alluded to the situation south of Turkey and how destabilizing that is. Well, obviously in Europe, that's being realized through this migration crisis. You live in Turkey, you see the migration that's flooding through Turkey, but Erdogan seems to really hold the key as to whether or not, how many numbers are moving into Germany and moving into the rest of Europe. How is that playing out? And even how does that relate to places, as you say, like the Baltics and these other countries, like Hungary, that have said, building a fence, we don't want them in. This is, in our time, you could argue this is the greatest crisis that we've seen since World War II in terms of movements of people.
Yeah, a couple of points. One, Turkey's proven that it can cut the flow. Once the deal happened, stopped. And if you go along the coastline in southeastern Turkey before the deal last year, every night you'd see people preparing, and every morning you could see what they had left behind as they were crossing, and it was tragic. So we all know the horrible stories, the iconic images. Yeah, you're right, that's stopped. So, okay, it shows that before that, Turkey maybe wasn't trying so hard, but now it is. And I think he'll keep trying. And there's something about Turkish culture that is actually quite attractive, which is there's a belief that if somebody comes knocking on your door or your country asking for help, you help them. So the issue of the 2.7 million, 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey is actually not a political issue, certainly not much of one. Generally, Turkish people think, okay, well, we have a duty to help them. Sure, there's grumbling on social media, concern about social services being strained, but I think actually President Erdogan himself is happy that there's such an influx of labor potential, of manpower. I know he doesn't talk about this publicly, but through other conversations, I've gotten a sense of the fact that he sees that there's great potential economically for Turkey there too. Of course, I think he recognizes there's also big problems with people who aren't going to get integrated into Turkish society. Only about 300,000, so about 10% of the refugees are actually in camps. The rest are floating around the economy. But I think Turkey sees an obligation as a nation, and the government sees an opportunity economically to have these people in the country, but there's a limit. So the version of the wall for the Turks sometimes is a safe zone in northern Syria to which some Syrians could return. That's sort of ostensibly the objective. At the same time, that safe zone cleared of PKK-affiliated Kurdish militants, the idea is to keep the Kurds from being able to form a unified block of territory on the Turkish border.
So, George, how does this relate, this whole Syrian and Turkish migration issue, how does that impact the Baltics and Europe in general?
What we're really looking at is two Europes. There's Northern Europe, the Poles, for example, that are heavily focused on the Russians. But I was just in Budapest, and what was interesting there, what I've also heard from Romania, is that they're no longer simply looking at the Russians. They think the Russians are something of a spent force. What they are looking at is the Turks. And their concern about this migration, which may be paranoid, is that it is being facilitated by the Turks to increase their presence not only in Europe, particularly in the Balkans. And in the Balkans, they are fearing some sort of destabilization by the Turks and by their Muslim allies, they think, the Bosnians, the Albanians, the Kosovos, and so on. So they're looking at the Turks much more seriously than they used to. And this is a sea change. I go there fairly frequently, and this is something that's happened over the past months, where they're looking at the Russians as, with that economy and their behavior in Ukraine, they're not coming. Not the Baltics' point of view, not the Polish point of view. But their point of view is we have another problem developing, and they read the refugee crisis as a Turkish tool. Not all of them, of course, but enough that it has to be taken seriously.
So I want to take a step back and take a look at everything that we've just discussed, which is a lot, from the U.S. perspective. Mm-hmm. You worked at the State Department on issues of Turkey and the surrounding region. How should the U.S. be looking at this situation, and how should they be getting involved, and what are they actually doing?
Yeah, I would hope that in the case of Syria, what's being explored, and I've heard some rumors about this, is something I alluded to previously, an agreement whereby Turkey would step up and provide real forces for the assault on Raqqa, do it completely in accordance with the partnership and alliance with the United States and NATO, as well as the extended coalition. in exchange for the U.S. saying, okay, then we don't need these YPG Kurdish operatives. That's a deal that makes logical sense, but I don't think Turkey is so willing to bleed that much, going back to some of the things George was saying earlier. So otherwise, I mean, if I were still in my old job or at the White House working on Turkey, I would say we've got to find a way to minimize the role of the YPG. We've got to find a way to coordinate more closely with our Turkish ally. They're indispensable. As George is saying, they're going to rise again. That's in our interest that Turkey remains strong and remains on side with us. I would beware of any deal with the Russians over Syria, and we know that the Trump administration was flirting with something earlier. Now it's politically untenable here in this town. And then I would look for ways more broadly to put an arm around the shoulder of Turkey as well. As difficult as it may seem with President Erdogan consolidating his power, we have a huge range of interests with Turkey. And you look at that map, I mean, Turkey is a country of so many personalities, if you will. I mean, it's a Caucasus country, a Middle Eastern country, it's a Balkan country. Parts of it feel like a quasi-European country. It's a Black Sea country. So if you look at where it is again on the map, Turkey was kind of a unifying force or unifying factor between the U.S. national interests in both Ukraine and in Syria. And we saw it play itself out with the shoot-down November 24th, 2 years ago, of the Russian fighter bomber. So there's so much on the agenda with Turkey. We should look at Turkey as not just a useful partner, but as our ally. And I think stay away from any sort of statements like happened right during the coup period where U.S. Secretary of State Kerry was calling into question whether or not it was a real coup. Instead of saying, thank goodness this coup didn't succeed. It's our NATO ally, we stand with it. And by the way, it's a democratically elected government that was under threat. Whether we like it or not, it's a democratically elected government, and it's in our interest to see democratically governments, especially in the Middle East, succeed.
George?
Ultimately, what happens in Syria is a fundamental question for the Turkish national security. It is not a fundamental interest to the United States. It's an interest, but not a fundamental interest. It's not one for Russians. The Turks want the United States to bear the burden. The Turks say, you kicked in the door, you pick up the pieces. In a thoroughly just world, that may be the way it works. It's not a thoroughly just world. The price for defeating ISIS is high. And the problem here is the U.S. government can't afford the casualties from a political point of view. Neither can the Turkish government. You have to understand at this point, with the promises that Erdogan has made, not among them are 10,000 dead fighting. He's not going to do that. And this is the basic problem, which is that nobody cares enough about it to really take an action. Remember, the Russians didn't go there because they had any strategic interest. They went there to demonstrate to their own people that in spite of their economic problems, Russia's a great power. They did moderately well. But we're looking at a situation where everybody wants ISIS destroyed by somebody else. And in the end, it's going to be Turkey, because no one else has an overriding interest. And that's Erdogan's problem. He doesn't want to get there. He wants to keep pushing everybody around so that it doesn't come down to, hey, it's your border, not ours. But that is the truth, and that's what it's going to come down to.
Well, some very interesting decisions coming down the pipe here over the next few months. George Friedman, Ambassador Bryza, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.